It's time for Mormonland, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
Before we start, here's a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com where you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, ad-free podcast episodes, and the full Mormonland newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's show. There was plenty of good growth news, at least on its books, for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 2025. A record number of convert baptisms of more than 385,000. An overall global membership climbing ever closer to 18 million, and at least 44 nations or territories with annual growth rates above 10%. At the same time, the United States, the nation with the most Latter-day Saints, saw its net raw numbers decline for the first time, and children of record continue to lag well below 100,000. Here to dissect the latest data, from the exceptional expansions in parts of the global south to the stagnant figures in other parts of the world, is independent researcher Matt Martinich, who tracks such data for the websites Cumorah.com and LDSchurchgrowth.blogspot.com. He joins us today from Colorado. Matt, welcome.
Thanks for having me, David.
Great. Okay, so this makes 2 years in a row with big jumps in convert baptisms. To what do you attribute that growth in converts?
Well, I think some of it is that there's more missionaries serving, but also the number of converts being baptized per missionary has increased as well. Mm-hmm. So it seems like it's a function of both missionaries being more efficient with finding and baptizing new converts, as well as there just being more missionaries to do that.
But the missionaries, the converts per missionary, it's down from what it used to be, right? Like in the, say, 70s and 80s?
Yeah, back from 1970s to 1990s, it typically was about 6 to 8 converts baptized per missionary. Last year, it was almost 5. It was 4.9. But that's quite a bit higher than what it has been, which has really been more about 3.4, 3.5.
Mm-hmm.
So, Matt, what surprised you the most about this latest report?
In terms of just the general statistical report for 2025?
Yeah.
I would say the thing that really stands out is just what David was mentioning in terms of the number of converts being baptized, because this is really a significant jump. And if we think back to historically, when we set the previous all-time record, that was in 1990. And back then, the standards for converts being baptized were not as stringent as they are today. And we have not just surpassed that record, but we've surpassed it by 55,000 converts. So that's a huge amount that previous record was surpassed by. And in 2024, we also had a really great year for convert baptisms in the church, a little over 300,000. That was the first time that had happened for a long time as well. So really, that is very encouraging news, and also really quite surprising, especially when we look at what the historical trends have been like in the last quarter century or even 50 years, where generally the story we've been getting is fewer and fewer convert baptisms, even when the church tries to revamp its proselyting efforts.
Yeah, so although much of the big boosts in growth were in Africa, the Philippines, Latin America, regions across the globe, you noted, had spots with substantial growth, or at least nations that stood out still. What does that say about the church's overall global footprint?
Really that it's expanding in terms of converts joining the church. And we have good data to support that. The country-by-country breakdown for membership figures for 2025 were released last week. And that provided really fascinating data where we had 44 countries and territories that had an annual membership growth rate of at least 10%. And that's just never happened before. I mean, that is really remarkable. And if we look at the geographic spread of those countries, it's not like these are all in Africa, where we see generally some of the most rapid growth, even with fairly large membership bases. But we're seeing this in places even like Serbia and Croatia. Of course, there's only, less than 1,000 members in each of those countries, but that's something we haven't seen since the 1990s, really, for a lot of these places. So, that's something that is really interesting and unique. Of course, it's not just Africa and a few of these smaller countries with not as many members. I mean, even countries like Spain, we had, really quite good membership growth last year, over 5% membership growth, to where there's now 72,000 Latter-day Saints in Spain, at least on the records. So that's pretty interesting and really quite unprecedented.
So Matt, you mentioned Spain. What countries with substantial Latter-day Saint memberships stood out to you with the most noteworthy growth?
So the Democratic Republic of the Congo definitely stands out as an outlier. And this is a country that, as of the end of last year, 160,000 Latter-day Saints now in that country, and membership increased by 19.2% last year. That is extremely unusual in the church. There have been some times in the past where we've seen growth that is that rapid with over 100,000 members on the records, but it is quite unusual, and previous instances of that have generally had pretty low quality converts. Now, in the DR Congo, that is not the case. It is quite common for church attendance to be higher than membership for many branches and wards. And even with the ones that don't have those type of phenomenal activity rates, they're still quite high, oftentimes 80% or so. So that's really interesting. And in terms of why we're seeing that growth accelerate in that country, it isn't necessarily that where the church has been established, there's larger numbers of people join the church in those centers like Kinshasa, Lubumbashi, Buji-Mayi. A lot of that is also that the church is very aggressively expanding into areas it's never been before. And we've had dozens of cities and villages have the first branches created just in the last 18 months. And in that country, it's generally been about maybe 1 or 2 cities a year. And then a few years ago, we started seeing a few more than that. And then, if I remember correctly, in the last 18 months, I think it's something like 25 to 30 cities and villages. So, I mean, we're really seeing aggressive national outreach expansion on a level that has really been unprecedented for that country.
We've talked with a number of missionaries who've served in, say, Europe or even some of the major metro areas in the United States. And they talk about a lot of the converts that they're baptizing are actually immigrants from Africa. Have you noticed that? And is there anything that supports that that's an actual trend or something?
Yeah, and that's really been a long-term trend. And that goes back, really, I would argue, over 100 years of where we see immigrants in countries join the church in larger numbers than the actual people that are considered to be natives of that country join the church. I mean, even if we go back to like the church in Ireland, the first converts and branches there were German immigrants. Similarly, in Argentina, those were German immigrants that joined the church. They were not Argentine Spanish-speaking converts, really, for many years. We saw that in Brazil as well. And so we see that today as in many areas of the world, whether they're from Africa or from Middle East or from Asia, it is really quite common to see that those groups are more receptive, and they tend to really provide a lot of opportunities for missionaries to teach and baptize and establish congregations. Although on the downside, there could be a lot of difficulties with making sure that they can establish core leadership. A lot of times these members tend to be a lot more transient, and that can create additional problems too.
Yeah. So let's talk about the United States. You note in your blog that the numbers fell, the net raw numbers fell for the first time. Now, it wasn't a lot, 186 people, but it was the first overall decrease. What do you see as the reasons for that decline?
We can speculate exactly of what it is. We don't know exactly, David. I mean, I'll give my thoughts about what likely happened, especially when we're getting reports from Elder Cook and General Conference in October that we had a 17% increase in convert baptisms from the previous year for North America. Now, I imagine that's mostly due to the United States because, there are missions and members in Canada, but that's a very small percent of that North American pie there. So in terms of what's likely driving that, I think it's a combination of several factors. I think one of it is that we're having fewer and fewer children being born into the church in terms of active member families. You alluded that earlier in the program with the number of children of record being added just stubbornly staying low in the low 90,000s. So I think that's a factor because natural growth is a big piece of what drives membership growth in the US. I think another one is that we're having an aging membership in the United States, where we're having a lot more members passing away due to old age. I think that some of that is also due to children of record who don't get baptized and are eventually dropped from the rolls. And so we have attrition there as well. I think some of it might be due to people that leave the church, that resign their membership. I don't really have any evidence to suggest that was any higher. If anything, it was actually probably lower last year than some previous years. And I think another piece that might be unique, and I'm sure would capture the interest of a lot of people that like to follow political things, is I wonder if this might also be due to immigrant members leaving the country due to the current political climate. And I think there's good data to support that, where we see, Puerto Rico is technically part of the United States, right? But we had a huge increase of 3,500 members in Puerto Rico, which makes no sense in terms of the mission would not baptize that many converts in 1 year. In Puerto Rico, it's been a place with pretty stagnant membership growth. I imagine it was probably due to membership records being updated and having Puerto Rican members, those records being sent to Puerto Rico or something like that to try to locate where they're actually at. So I think a lot of this could be due to people moving to other places, countries where they're originally from. And I also think that there's a possibility that might have been some more intensive record cleanup work. I mean, the address unknown file for the church is quite substantial as far as I understand, and there's hundreds of thousands of people in there. And so if they really were to make some more diligent efforts to clean that up, we could really see an anomaly like this last year when we wouldn't have expected that otherwise, given the other trends that we're aware of.
It does make what you bring up about immigration right now and the issue it is in the United States. It does make one wonder if, like, convert baptisms of those immigrants in the United States might be affected when the new reports come out for this year, if it could affect convert baptism rates here.
Possibly. I did collect some survey data. I only got a few hundred responses in the middle of last year, and I was really quite shocked at some. It was actually a recurrent finding in many large cities in the United States where some of these Spanish-speaking congregations were having over 50 convert baptisms in a single year, which is pretty remarkable. So, that is a possibility where we might not see that this year based on some of the changes that have been going on. So, yeah, that'll be interesting to see what happens.
So, is there something the church could or should be doing differently in the United States to improve those numbers?
Peggy, I don't think there is anything that can necessarily be done. If it could, it would have been done already. I think what we see that the church has been focusing on to try to address those more in the long term have been things like building more temples, really trying to get people to go to the temple more often, the FSY conferences that oftentimes occur in universities that really provide a high quality social and spiritual experience for a lot of people, reducing the missionary age, trying people to go on missions. I think those are all things the church has some control over that can have some long-term impact on these numbers. But at the same time, like, the church can only do so much to encourage people to have more kids, and I don't think if you try to persuade somebody to have more children, they're going to have kids for the right reason. That needs to be an intrinsic personal decision to have that be successful for everybody. So that's going to be a very hard thing to change. And there's a lot of factors that play into why that birth rate has been declining. But in terms of things the church might have some control with that over would be some of the things I mentioned, and also really trying to help people get married in the church, stay active, and not get divorced as much as that's possible and appropriate. So,
yeah, I was going to ask about this next a little bit, Matt, and that's the lagging children of record. If you look at the graphs, it's just steadily down, although it's gone up a little bit from some of the low points, but it's still well below 100,000 a year. Why is that concerning for the church in the long term?
Well, it's deeply concerning because I think it really stresses the problems we're seeing with establishing full member families where we have a husband and wife with children active in the church. And I think that this indicates that is becoming more and more of a challenge. And if you think of all of this growth the church has had in the last 40, 45 years, we should be seeing many more many more children of record being added. I mean, really, it should be like 400,000 or something like that now. If we were to see where the growth has been, what the birth rates are like in a lot of these countries where the church has been growing most rapidly. And instead, we've actually seen it decline by a quarter over a period of time when church membership has nearly quadrupled in size. And so I think that really speaks to compounding inactivity and convert retention issues. It speaks to attitudes changing about children and how many children they have. And also, I think it's really shows how the church is less insulated culturally from national norms in terms of what people see about childbearing and having families. And so I think a lot of those factors are going together that are responsible for why we have this lagging children of record piece. And in terms of internationally, I think it also speaks that the church has struggled to really create full member families in these countries that have fairly high birth rates. And otherwise, we would expect to see at least some commensurate increase, and there's none. It's just stubbornly flat, and it's not showing any sign of change, really. So
what countries have you seen continued slides in membership?
In terms of net losses?
Yes.
There's very few countries where we have consistent losses in membership. And when we do see that, Peggy, it's usually by just like a couple dozen or something. And those countries would be like Denmark and Norway. Generally it's fairly stagnant or flat. And Ukraine, we've definitely seen a drop in membership, although last year membership increased by a little over 1% for the first time in a number of years. So, a lot of times when we see a more stark drop in membership, something big happened. A war happened, some sort of economic thing happened that's driven people to move. These tend to be factors that really drive those more unexpected set of drops in membership. But really, we don't see net losses of membership year over year for almost really any country.
So you frequently, Matt, point to the importance of congregational growth. Now, you just barely on your website posted an analysis of that. What did the latest stats show about congregational growth?
Yeah, so last year we had a really quite fairly good year for the number of new congregations being created, and the net increase in those congregations, almost 400. So that's fairly good. It's still lagging at a rate that's lower than the membership growth. And that congregational growth is valuable because to operate congregations, you need to have a certain number of active members typically. And so that can give us insight in terms of what is the actual number of people going to church on Sunday, contributing. How is that changing over time? Because the church doesn't publish sacrament meeting attendance figures. And even if it did, it would still not give us the full picture because sometimes people are sick or there's visitors there or something happened and the weather's bad or whatever. So it only gives us, even with the church's statistics, if they were released, a partial picture of that. So congregational growth, I think, really provides value in terms of active membership increase and also expansion into new areas. Like I said, overall, things looked really quite good. We also had the highest number of countries that had at least a net increase of 4 congregations in 2025 that the church has ever had, which I think is a great development and shows that we're seeing that growth occurring around the world. It's not just concentrated to 15, 16 countries, which is what it historically has been the last quarter century. And instead, we're seeing that occurring in a lot more places and also in countries that already have a lot of congregations too.
The leader, again, I saw was the DRC, of course. What are other notables in the top, say, 5 or 10?
Well, the United States is number 2.
It's number 2, yeah.
Of 63 congregations. So the last few years, we've actually had a net decrease of about a dozen or so units a year. And so this last year, we had that reversed, which I thought was interesting. And even though we had that little net decrease in membership for the year. So I think that's valuable to indicate that, it's not like the church is collapsing in the United States, it's falling apart, members are leaving in droves. That's just not true. If that were true, we would see that reflected in there being consistent numbers of declines in congregations. And the church often will wait, a number of years before consolidating. But really that's only done to really strengthen the active membership generally. So I think that's important in the United States. Philippines also had its highest year for net membership increase since 2001, if I remember correctly. So it's been about a quarter century. Had a net increase of 46 congregations. And that was at a rate higher than membership growth for the Philippines. And so that just stands as an ongoing testament to the remarkable reversal the church has had in that country, where we had 25 years ago, our current president of the church went to the Philippines to really get things back on track with a lot of the leadership and member activity problems that are going on. And now the Philippines has stood as a shining example of what can happen even when we have had those kind of problems in the past, to where we've had evidence that active membership is increasing at a faster rate than raw membership, where we've had the number of stakes in the Philippines increase from about 80 to about 140 now. And that's just in the last 15 years or so. So, really we've seen tremendous progress there that's ongoing, and just really exciting to see that's being sustained and almost entirely done by the Filipino missionary force and church leadership there. And then the other countries that are on the higher end of that list are mostly in Africa, but we have Peru on there. We even have Spain on there. So there's a number of countries where we've seen some good growth over the last year with number of units.
So you mentioned the Philippines. Back in the day when President Oaks was there, the retention was like 5% or something really low. What would you say it is now, retention?
Yeah, I know what you're referring to. I saw that statistic once, and I wonder if it was an error. I believe it was like 2% or something, and it was like in 2001. I remember reading it years ago and being quite skeptical of that. But in terms of what it is today, I don't have any current statistics that I can say with confidence this is what it is. But I would say it's at least 50%, and maybe even higher than that. So I think things look much better than they have. And we're seeing districts regularly becoming stakes. And, just a couple years ago, those standards for stakes we created were increased substantially in terms of active membership requirements for outside of the US and Canada. And so that even speaks even more to the quality of the growth we're seeing in the Philippines.
And lots of new temples coming there too, which I think would indicate there's someone to go to those temples.
Right. And I think with a lot of the President Nelson era temples, of course, we saw that being done a bit more aggressively in the past, to say the least. But you're absolutely right. I mean, when we had just one temple in the Philippines, President Hinckley visited with the members of the church there and said, you're not going to get a temple in Cebu City until you start paying your tithing more consistently, because otherwise we're not going to have people that are going to be able to go to the temple. So why are we going to build a temple if it's not going to be able to be utilized? And that was in 2005 when he said that, if I'm not mistaken. And today I think we're at 16 or 17 temples that have been built or that are planned for the Philippines. So we've really seen a remarkable turnaround there.
So what would you say is the overall retention rate for the church, the whole church?
I tend to focus on terms of saying it's probably about half of converts are retained after 12 months. That tends to be sort of the average historically. And I think the harder issue the church has had, back 20, 25 years ago, the issue was how can we keep them active for longer than a few months? That problem has improved, quite a bit to where at a year, from the hundreds of surveys, really thousands of surveys I've had from returned missionaries, really suggest that 50% is kind of the global average, I would say. But the problem is if we look at 2 years, 5 years, 10 years out, that number goes down substantially, unfortunately. So, that's more of the bigger problem now is retention for the medium to long term.
So last question, how might the 55 new missions coming online this summer affect growth in those areas?
Yeah, that's a really exciting and interesting thing to think about because with those missions and where they're being created, and I believe I talked to the guys about this before when that announcement came out. I mean, that has tremendous potential to maintain the momentum that's been achieved and also to accelerate it even further. And with the locations these missions have been announced in, and the opportunities for expansion in a lot of these places, it's really a lot of interesting options and possibilities are going to be coming online soon. I mean, one of the things I think as a lot of Latter-day Saints, especially in the United States, when we think of what the church is like in the Philippines, for example, or what the church is like in Brazil, we think, oh yeah, the church is fairly big there. About 1%, 2% of the people are Latter-day Saints now, at least on the records. We think the church is kind of everywhere, and it's not. I mean, even in the Philippines, there are entire provinces without any Latter-day Saint congregations, even ones that aren't predominantly Muslim. And we have that same situation, of course, in Africa, where we have large swaths of countries like Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and like Cote d'Ivoire, where there's no church presence. And a lot of the reason why is because the churches lack the resources and infrastructure to expand into these areas, and has historically had that centers of strength model where they're trying to build up the church to be self-sufficient in select areas before expansion. And that's really happened in a lot of places. And so I think we're going to see a lot of expansion into new areas with these new missions coming on.
The name of the website, again, is ldschurchgrowth.blogspot.com, where you can read Matt's analysis. Matt Martnick, thanks again so much for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher-Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrip.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.